As the early morning mist began to clear, the German troops, confident in their superiority, pushed forward. They had been met with little resistance thus far, and their artillery and tanks rumbled steadily across the fields. The plan was simple: a quick advance, supported by heavy firepower, to crush the enemy. Their objective was to break through the Soviet lines and secure the strategic town that lay just beyond the horizon. But what they didn't know was that they were walking into a carefully planned trap, one that would expose the limitations of their heavy machinery and artillery in the brutal realities of this conflict. For weeks, Soviet intelligence had been monitoring the movements of German armored divisions. The constant reconnaissance, both from the air and ground, had given the Soviets enough information to predict the enemy's attack route. The Germans, however, had grown complacent in their approach, relying heavily on their formidable tanks and artillery to do the job. But the Soviets, knowing they couldn't match the Germans in sheer firepower, had something else up their sleeve. They were preparing a deadly ambush, setting the stage for the trap. The battlefield chosen for this trap was perfect. The terrain, though seemingly open and easy to traverse, hid several natural obstacles. Narrow valleys, dense forests, and muddy fields surrounded the open plains where the Germans expected to fight. The Soviets knew that these natural barriers would slow down the tanks and make them vulnerable targets. Mines had been strategically placed in key areas, while anti-tank units and infantry hid in the nearby woods, ready to strike at the opportune moment. The Soviet commander in charge of the operation had also positioned several decoy tanks in visible locations. From a distance, they appeared to be operational, leading the Germans to believe that they were engaging Soviet armor head-on. However, these decoy tanks were nothing more than hollow shells, designed to lure the Germans into a false sense of security. As the German tanks approached, they were unaware that the true Soviet forces were lying in wait just beyond the trees, ready to launch their surprise attack. The Germans pushed forward. At first, everything seemed to be going according to the German plan. Their tanks rolled across the fields with ease, and their artillery units fired relentlessly, softening up the supposed Soviet defenses ahead. The roar of tank engines filled the air, and the ground shook as the massive war machines advanced. The German soldiers, trained and battle-hardened, moved with precision, confident that they were about to overrun the enemy. But then, something went wrong. As the German tanks reached the middle of the open field, there was a sudden explosion. One of the lead tanks was hit by an unseen force, its turret blown off in a fiery blast. The German soldiers stopped in their tracks, momentarily confused by what had happened. Before they could react, another explosion ripped through the air, followed by yet another. Panic began to set in as the Germans realized they had driven straight into a minefield. The Soviet forces, hidden in the forest, sprang into action. Anti-tank rifles and artillery opened fire from concealed positions, targeting the immobilized German tanks. The thick smoke and chaos of the explosions made it difficult for the German commanders to issue clear orders. Tanks were stranded, unable to maneuver in the soft mud and thick grass, while Soviet infantry units moved in to exploit the confusion. Artillery fails to deliver. Desperate to regain control of the situation, the Germans called for artillery support. Shells began to rain down on the battlefield, but the Soviet forces had anticipated this. They had dug in deep, constructing fortified positions that were difficult to hit. Most of the German shells either missed their targets or landed harmlessly in the empty fields. The Soviet soldiers, well-trained and disciplined, stayed low and waited for the perfect moment to counterattack. Meanwhile, Soviet artillery, which had been silent until now, unleashed a devastating barrage on the German positions. The enemy artillery units, focused on trying to hit the Soviet infantry, were caught off guard by this sudden and concentrated attack. Many of the German artillery pieces were destroyed before they could even relocate. What had started as a planned German offensive was quickly turning into a disaster. The German collapse. With their tanks immobilized and their artillery ineffective, the German forces found themselves in a dire situation. The Soviet infantry, emboldened by the success of the ambush, began to move in from the flanks, cutting off any potential escape routes. Machine guns and mortars rained down fire on the confused German troops, who were now fighting for their lives. As the Soviet forces closed in, the battlefield became a chaotic scene of destruction. German soldiers, many of whom had been confident in their superior technology and training, were now struggling to survive. The harsh reality of being trapped with no clear way out began to set in. The heavy fire from Soviet machine guns cut down anyone who attempted to flee, while mortars exploded around them, shredding whatever was left of their defenses. German officers barked desperate orders, trying to rally their men for a counterattack, but the confusion confusion and panic were overwhelming. Soldiers who had never experienced such intense close-quarter combat were paralyzed with fear, unsure of whether to hold their ground or attempt a risky retreat. The sound of Soviet artillery grew louder, the blasts shaking the earth and rattling the nerves of even the most battle-hardened veterans. On the Soviet side, the infantry advanced methodically, using every piece of cover available. They had the upper hand and were determined not to let the Germans escape. The ambush had been meticulously planned, and now they were executing it with precision. Soviet soldiers moved in small groups, leapfrogging from one position to another, laying down suppressing fire as their comrades moved closer to the German lines. They could see the fear in the eyes of their enemies and knew that victory was near. One Soviet platoon, armed with anti-tank weapons, made their way towards the immobilized German armor. The once feared Tiger tanks, which had dominated the battlefields of Europe, now stood silent and vulnerable. Soviet soldiers wasted no time, lobbing grenades into the hatches of the tanks and setting them ablaze. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky as the proud symbols of German military might were reduced to smoldering wrecks. For the Germans, the situation had gone from bad to worse. With their tanks destroyed and their artillery silenced, they were left with only their rifles and machine guns to defend themselves, but it was not enough. The Soviets were relentless, pressing the attack with increasing intensity. The German lines, already stretched thin, began to crumble under the pressure. In the midst of the chaos, some German units tried to organize a last-ditch defense. Small pockets of resistance formed, with soldiers digging in behind makeshift barricades or taking cover in the ruins of nearby buildings. They fought with grim determination, knowing that surrender would likely mean death or imprisonment. But the Soviets were relentless, picking off the defenders one by one with sniper fire and grenades. Despite their best efforts, the German position was untenable. Soviet forces had encircled them completely, cutting off any hope of reinforcements or resupply. The German troops were running out of ammunition, food, and water, and their morale was shattered. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had swept through Europe with seeming invincibility, was now on the brink of collapse. As night fell, the Soviets continued their relentless assault, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. They crept closer to the German positions, taking out sentries and capturing strategic points. By morning, the German defense had all but collapsed. The remaining German soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, began to surrender in droves. Those who refused to lay down their arms were quickly overwhelmed by the advancing Soviet troops. The ambush had been a complete success. The Soviet forces had not only stopped the German advance, but had destroyed an entire division in the process. The victory was a testament to the skill and bravery of the Soviet soldiers, who had turned the tide of the battle with their superior tactics and determination. As the Soviet commanders surveyed the battlefield, they knew that this was just one of many victories to come. The German war machine was faltering, and the Soviets were gaining momentum. Each victory brought them closer to ultimate triumph, and the destruction of the German division was a powerful symbol of their growing strength. For the Germans, the defeat was a harsh reminder that their dominance on the battlefield was no longer assured. The Soviet forces were proving to be a formidable adversary, and the road to victory in the east was far more difficult than they had anticipated. As the surviving German soldiers were led away as prisoners of war, many of them realized that the war they had once believed to be winnable was now slipping